Thanks for joining us this afternoon. This is the Texas PACE Authority's third Thursday at 2 training series, December edition for 2022. This is the final training webinar we'll be doing this calendar year. We'll continue this format into 2023 and maybe refine it a bit, but we appreciate you joining us today and in past trainings as well. Today, the topic's going to be the Section 179D changes and impact with the Inflation Reduction Act. We have a guest speaker, an expert on the subject, David Diaz, who's with us today. But before we hand it over to David, I'm going to provide a few updates on the PACE activity in the state of Texas, which has been very, very busy the last few months. I'm Dub Taylor, the Chief Operating Officer of Texas PACE Authority. Been with TPA a couple of years. Before that, managed energy efficiency programs in the public sector, and prior to that, my private sector experience in the commercial real estate business and property appraisal business. For our webinar today, everyone is muted and your video is disabled to preserve bandwidth. If you have questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen or the top, wherever it's located on your screen, and not the chat. We'll keep an eye on both, but would prefer you use the Q&A. And if questions come up throughout the presentation, we'll keep an eye on those and try to get to those as we go. If we miss those, we'll certainly have time at the end to get to any questions that haven't been answered. If you attend today and you request this, you'll get a survey and also an option to request a PDH certificate. So you can get an hour PDH, professional development hour, for attending this webinar. You'll also get a copy of the slide deck with embedded links, and the recording will be available on our website and our YouTube channel, along with other T5 presentations and webinars from the past. If you go to our website, as a reminder where those are located, under the resources drop-down, you'll see the section for T5 webinars. And starting back in April 16th of 2020, just after we went into COVID mode, that's when we started this, and we've got many of those available for you in an archive fashion to view as you need to. So our agenda today, just a few topics, a quick update on the Texas PACE market, cover a little bit about our new training portal that was launched just a month ago, and then we'll hand it over to David to cover the main topic here, 179D. So let's talk about what's happening with the PACE market. The footprint continues to expand. More cities and counties have adopted PACE, CPACE, in all corners of the state. We now have 83 local PACE programs. The newest is Gray County, up in the Panhandle near Amarillo. Pampa, Texas is the county seat. And we now cover 73% of the state's population. So even though the blue shaded counties and cities make up the minority in the map, that's really where the population centers are. So almost anywhere you need access to PACE, it's available today. And if it's not yet available, then we're happy to work with the city or county to get that program set up. As far as transactions, things have really hit this inflection point, and hockey stick growth, as you've heard, really is a good representation of the type of activity we've seen this year. Looking at the graph down to the left, the first year that PACE was operational was back in 2015. It bumped up a little bit, kind of on a steady growth pattern until this year. And 2022, things have really taken off. Total of $355 million of closings and PACE investment through the history of the program. Just this year, in 2022, $165 million has closed. Last month alone, $73 million. And that includes the largest Texas PACE project to date, a project in the city of Dallas that was $40 million. So things continue to increase, and there's a number of projects yet in the pipeline that are expected to close by the end of this year. And as a reminder, our role, we really, I always say that we really referee these transactions. We work for the cities and the counties directly to run the PACE programs for them. We don't provide the capital. We don't do the work, the contracting work. The service providers do that. So we work with the property owners and all these stakeholders to ensure that the projects that get put together meet all the requirements under the enabling PACE law and associated guidelines. And a big part of that is training. And so in addition to webinars like this one and the series we're doing today, we have a number of different training resources. All of these are listed here on our new training portal, and we have classes there. We have different courses that you can take. Some are no cost, some there is a charge. We have one on benchmarking, and then the newest one is what we call the self-paced service provider training, deliberate pun on words. And there, if you are a contractor, an independent third-party reviewer, an engineer, anyone working on a PACE project, and you want to understand and go through the basics of how it works in Texas, you can take this training on your own time. You can register by clicking on the box there. There's a $25 charge. If you are a veteran-owned business, minority-owned business, woman-owned business, that fee can be waived, and there's a process for doing that. And what's covered in that training is 3 different areas. These are recorded videos. They're sort of a PACE 101, how it works, the nuts and bolts, the technical standards and guidance, and then how to put a project together. There are quizzes at the end of each of the sections, and if you achieve at least a passing grade, then you will receive a service provider e-badge that can be used for marketing purposes on your own website. And then on our website, under the service provider listing category, you'll be notated as a trained PACE service provider. So that's a new resource that's there, and we'll have even more training resources in 2023. Okay, so getting to the primary focus today, 179D, I'd like to introduce David Diaz. He's a managing partner with Walker Reed Strategies, a couple of decades of experience in construction real estate with the focus on energy efficiency. He's involved in a number of energy efficiency and specialty tax services organizations. He regularly lectures on 179D tax deductions as well as 45L residential tax credit. The focus today for CPACE is going to be more 179D and the changes. And we are happy to have you with us today, David, and I will stop sharing my screen and let you take over. And again, if you've got questions for any of our attendees along the way, please enter them in the Q&A box and we'll keep an eye on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dub. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to your group today. And really want to thank everybody for taking a couple moments this afternoon to listen to the webinar and learn a little bit about Section 179D. And I'll sprinkle in some 45L there as it may be applicable, but I'll focus, like Dub said, on the 179D. Like Dub mentioned, we're specialty energy tax incentive provider. So our firm, Walker Reed Strategies, is we're one of the industry leaders focused in this space. We've been doing this since 2009. At this point, 179D has only been around since 2006, and the popularity realistically and the ability to do it was started back in 2008 once the IRS issued the guidance that allowed these programs to be actually taken advantage of, right? So Congress put the 179D in place in 2005 as part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and it took the IRS a couple of years to get the information out and the bulletins out on how these programs were to be run, administered, and whatnot. So a lot of exciting news here about 179D. I'm gonna really focus get a high level give you guys a high level understanding of how 179D works, what the benefits are, and then also focus on some of the changes that are moving forward as part of a more recent act that was done by Congress here in the Inflation Reduction Act a couple months ago, that has brought about some pretty substantial expansion and changes to the Section 179D tax deductions. So again, our firm, Energy Tax Incentive Providers, we are that independent party that's required by the IRS to be able to claim some of these incentives. So I'll get right to it and jump in a little bit to discuss some of the benefits and how 179D works. So 179D is essentially a tax deduction that is available And it goes down two very kind of unique paths. So I'll get into this path up here. There's the private sector's use of the 179D, and then there's on a secondary front, there is the public sector's use, which can be used by designers and energy contractors and folks who are involved in the design and implementation of energy improvements or energy or new construction on government-owned buildings. So getting into 179D a little bit, like I said, it really goes down one of two paths. So I'm going to refer to them, even though it's the same code section, and a lot of the things are very similar, but the way it's used, even the tax benefit on them, they can be very different all at the same time within the same code section. And then I'm also going to get into a tiny bit on the 45L, and I'll keep that light, but the 45L, which is a residential new homes tax credit for the energy efficient construction of residential homes. So that's a very attractive tax credit that's out there, that's available for if you got multifamily developments or brand new home builders. That can be a great opportunity for those projects as well. So a little bit of let's talk about 179D a little bit. So 179D, it's a accelerated depreciation incentive. When we look at it in the private sector, it ends up being an accelerated depreciation benefit that allows a project that has met certain energy criteria and certain energy targets. If they are achieved, that party, the taxpayer who's responsible and owns and has taxable basis in the asset at the time of construction, can get up to $1.88 per square foot in accelerated depreciation year one benefit. So basically, you take let's give you an example there. You got a new construction commercial building that was built, and that commercial building is worth, I don't know, let's call it 100,000 square feet, and 100,000 square feet, let's call that, I don't know, $800,000, $900,000. I'm probably light on the cost there, but 100,000 square feet, I'm sorry, not $800,000, couple million bucks in construction cost. So you're going to have the ability, if that building, once constructed, if it meets and achieves a 50% reduction against ASHRAE, in this case, it's ASHRAE 90.1 2007, you have the ability to take up to $1.88 per square foot in year one. So you can take 100,000 square feet and get $180,000 in year one tax deduction. Now, it is going to reduce the basis of your 39-year asset, right? So the depreciable basis of this new building is going to have most of the lion's share of the assets going to be sitting on the depreciation schedule as a 39-year asset, and it is going to reduce it. So it is a timing difference, right? So it's a cash flow creation, accelerated depreciation benefit that really would have to fit the right type of taxpayer who is looking for cash flow, is looking for additional tax deductions, and they should be looking to hold on to these buildings for a longer period of time, right? So that's one of the key components when we look at it for the private sector is it has to be a little bit long-term of a hold, right? Because if they sell the building, then they're going to face what's called recapture, which they would have to then forego that depreciation that they accelerated in the first place as part of this incentive. So it's it's a situation where 3 years is usually the break-even point for a 179D study of the building owner hold on to that building for 3 years. Anything go after 5 years, you start to you be a little positive on the depreciation benefits, and then anything after that, you're in the completely in the green on the other side of 5 years. So now there's a special provision and a special kicker for Section 179D, a special rule essentially that allows government-owned buildings, and I'm going to speak about 179D in the way it's been historically used before the Inflation Reduction Act. And in a couple slides, I'll get into the new changes that are coming up. But historically, the way it's been operated is government-owned buildings have had the ability to allocate that deduction to the person who's primarily responsible for the design. So there's that special rule where if you're a government-owned building, you obviously don't have tax liability. You don't have the ability to take advantage of any the tax break and the tax benefit that gets created from building an energy efficient building. So in order to incentivize and motivate the designers to build and design these things very energy efficiently, they've had this special rule that allows that to be allocated via an allocation letter to the designer for up to $1.88 per square foot. So that's a very powerful usage of this incentive. It's a good one. I'll get into the nitty-gritty of it a little later on how that designer allocation piece works. But it's a very attractive piece to the incentive. And then the 45L residential credit is a $2,000 credit per unit, per dwelling unit. So, if you have if you're a home builder, have home builders you work for, or multifamily apartments that are 3 stories or less, it's a very, very attractive incentive because it's a tax credit. It's not a deduction. So the dollar for dollar value there is a lot higher and is a lot more beneficial. As far as who can benefit, when we look at 179D, again, in the private sector, we're looking at commercial building owners, owner occupiers. So somebody that privately owns a building and has basis at the time of construction or major renovation or energy improvements were done. When we look at section 179D from a designer's perspective, we're looking at designers, architects, engineers, ESCOs, energy companies. It can be a contractor, but the contractor has to be involved in the design. Those parties can have the allocation given to them for the section 179D on their government projects that they work on. So that's again, very, very attractive component and part of the tax code section. And then as far as 45L goes, it's looking at developers of residential homes or apartments that have basis at the time of construction. So that's the focus there and who can benefit. When we look at the project types, and again, you're looking at new construction, retrofits for 179D. That's the key there, whether it be new construction or major renovation retrofit. And then 45L, again, it's usually new construction. Very few major renovations qualify, but they are a candidate. 179D, as far as the deadline. So historically, 179D has been like an on and off thing, where it's every couple of years it would expire. Then we'd have to wait for Congress to renew it, the deduction. So there was a little bit of this perception or this lack of use around the incentive, because you couldn't really count on it on the front end of a project to help monetize or help provide some financial incentive, because you start a project this year, but it expires at the end of the year. What if you don't finish in time? What if the incentive is not available? So you couldn't really factor those incentives into the financials and make it part of the of your construction budget, or couldn't expand budget, couldn't save more energy. You couldn't use it in the way it was meant to be used, right? The whole purpose here is to incentivize you to build more energy efficiently. And with that on and off expiration, it was never able to really take shape and take flight the way it should have, and be monetized and used the way it should have within the marketplace and in the industry. So, so in 2020, they made 179D permanent, which was nice. It was at this point, it would take a act of Congress to repeal the incentive, but it was made permanent. And then it was further expanded under the Inflation Reduction Act here this year in 2022, with some major changes to it for the next 10 years, which it would essentially, in theory, it could revert back to the previous methodology after 10 years. So you have the original 179D version with its laws and the way it was previously written. That's a permanent incentive, and it could, in theory, be reverted back in the future. So you got 45L. That one expired at the end of 2021, and it's been extended since then as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So As far as qualification, so you guys are PACE, you guys are building very energy efficient buildings to be able to qualify for your financing and be able to meet the requirements of your PACE program, right? 179D is it's actually not that hard to qualify for. So, I mean, realistically, the projects you guys are working on should all be a great candidate for the purpose of 179D. I mean, we see about 90% of the projects we look at end up qualifying at the highest level of 179D. They achieve 50% or greater energy cost reduction against ASHRAE 90.1 2007, which is the baseline that we have to use to certify these projects. So we see great results from that point of view. And when we look at and analyze projects for the purpose of 179D, and with 45L, we get about 80% qualification on those. They do well. It's a 50% improvement requirement against ASHRAE 2006. But again, it's still very, very attractive incentive and a little bit more attractive financially than 179D, but a little less of them end up qualifying for the deduction. And as far as the requirements as how you end up getting a 179D, so one of the main requirements is that you need a professional engineer, independent third party to verify and do the modeling and the site visits to be able to claim a 179D. And that's for both the government side or the private sector. The only difference on the government side is that in addition to that, you have to have a allocation letter that's given to you by that government agency, and basically signing over their rights to the deduction passed on to you as the designer. And 45L, it's very similar modeling process, just it has to be done by a HERS rater. And again, that's the role that our firm plays. We're that independent third-party verification firm, and that's what we do in this process of helping you guys claim these incentives. So,
David, there is one question that popped up.
Sure.
Does it apply to nonprofit buildings, nonprofit-owned buildings, new and existing?
It will be. So as part of the past 179D, anything 2022 and prior, no, it does not apply. But moving forward under the changes of the Inflation Reduction Act, that's actually one of the major changes that came up. So thank you for that question. That's a great question. So I'm excited. I got to use a Game of Thrones slide. If you don't watch Game of Thrones, then this will, maybe you'll miss the reference here. But I've always wanted to use a Game of Thrones slide in one of my presentations. I finally had the opportunity. So there's major changes coming to both 179D and 45L. So I'll jump right into those and discuss that a little bit. If you look over here at our logo, I got to give my graphics people some credit on this one. I like what they did here, but you got the previous incentive has been at $1.80 and bumped up to $1.88 with some inflation adjustments that were permitted to be done to the incentive a couple of years ago. So starting for projects that are getting placed into service in 2023 and beyond, you have the opportunity to take that $1.80 max potential, and it's going to bump up all the way to $5 a square foot. So that's a huge bump on this incentive. Now, with all great things, there's always a trade-off, right? So there's always going to be that the other side to this coin is in order to get that higher deduction amount, Congress and the way they wrote this Inflation Reduction Act, there's prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements kind of all over this bill, and specifically around 179D and 45L. In order to hit that higher threshold, get that higher dollar amount, the project has to meet the prevailing wage requirements. I have another slide. On the next slide, I get all into the prevailing wage, and I'll discuss that. But just keep in mind that one of the abilities to get that higher deduction amount is that the project has to have been built using and having prevailing wages paid on that project. So if the project does not meet prevailing wage, then it drops down to $1. So they're actually penalizing you from what it previously was. It used to be $1.80 per square foot. Now they're penalizing you and bringing it down from $5 to $1 if you don't meet the prevailing wage requirement. So the way it's working now, 179D historically had been broken up into three categories: lighting, building envelope, and HVAC. Now they've kind of done away with that methodology and that model, right? Now we look at the building as a whole, and we're looking at its reduction against ASHRAE standard in place. And if you hit 25% energy cost savings reduction against the ASHRAE, current ASHRAE standard, you're going to be able to achieve at $2.50 as the base starting point. And then for each additional percentage point of reduction beyond that 25%, you're getting an additional 10 cents a square foot until you hit the $5 per square foot mark, which is the cap and the most you can get on one of these projects. So, so again, 25% gets you $2.50 per square foot. Each additional percentage point gets you 10 cents more for each additional percentage point. So, example, if you save 30%, you're going to get $3 a square foot, and you save 35, you're going to get $3.50 a square foot, until you hit 50%. If you have 50% saving, you get the $5. Anything above 50%, you're still capped at the $5. So, and correspondingly, if you do a 25% and do not meet prevailing wage, now you're looking at 50 cents per square foot and a 2 cent per square foot for each additional percentage point until you hit the dollar. So that's the general gist of these changes, the major change, right, around the 179D and the Inflation Reduction Act. So that, again, any projects that were placed in service 2022 and in the past, we can still look at them under the old rules. You still have the ability to take advantage of the 179D under those old rules. Anything that gets placed in service in 2023 and beyond, now we're looking at the new rules. Prevailing wage comes into play, and we're have the ability to go from $1.88 to $5 a square foot. So that's the some of the major changes. Del, we got questions?
Yeah, I've got one more question. I think you just touched on it, but the question is, do projects that start in 2022 but are completed in 2023 eligible?
Great question. I like this group already. So I'm actually going to answer that in the next slide. I get into that pretty in-depthly here. So let's talk about the prevailing wage a little bit, and let's talk about what that looks like. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty that's been kind of since this bill came out. The way this works is these bills get put out by Congress, then the IRS comes out, and the IRS has to now issue notices and guidance around how they actually go and get operated or used within the market. So a couple of weeks ago, at the end of November, the IRS came out with the notice 2022-61, which provided the information on how prevailing wage was going to work and how it was going to apply for Section 179D and Section 45L, along with a bunch of other provisions that were affected by the Inflation Reduction Act, which honestly we don't specialize in, so it's kind of out of our wheelhouse. But so a couple things to keep in mind. So prevailing wage, in order for a project to meet prevailing wage and qualify under the prevailing wage rules, all the labor on the project has to have been performed by and paid prevailing wage within that region. So the Department of Labor through SAM.gov puts out, for whatever that zip code is, a prevailing wage rate per category, per area. So that's all published information that's available. And now anybody who works on that project has to be paid that minimum prevailing wage or better, right? And you have to maintain, one of the requirements to be able to claim the higher deduction amount is you have to maintain books of record and certified payroll essentially on all those folks that worked on the project, how many hours they worked, what it looked like, and what they were paid. So that's one of the major requirements there. If for some reason Department of Labor does not have published rates for the work in your area, it's actually your responsibility as the taxpayer that's trying to claim this incentive to reach out to them and verify what the proper labor rates will be for your project, for your area, for all the different categories of folks that you have working on that job. And then there's an apprenticeship requirement where 12.5% of the total hours worked on the job have to be performed by apprentices. qualified, certified apprentices that are part of an apprenticeship program on the project. Now, there is a small caveat around that apprenticeship requirement in which you are not, if for some reason you cannot find sufficient apprentices to man those 12.5 hours, you have to make a reasonable effort to do so, and you need to document that that you went through you reached out to whatever apprentice programs were, and that the folks weren't available to man the job. And if you're able to document that, then you can waive that 12.5% apprenticeship requirement. But there's specific requirements there where you can a process for trying to do so and not qualifying, and you can essentially be exempt from the apprenticeship piece of the program from that point of view. Back to the question that Dub asked a second ago. So there was a 60-day window from when that notice was issued, that if any project, basically any project that starts after that 60-day window, has to meet the prevailing wage requirement in order to take advantage and get the higher deduction amount. But if your project started prior to January 30th, 2023, and has been ongoing and continuous, so there's a continuity requirement here. There's a specific definition for beginning of construction. You know, like pre-construction activity doesn't qualify. It's not a eligible to be considered starting construction. So there's specific requirements around the having be substantial construction and actual construction occurring, and the construction then has to continue, you know, somewhat continuous, right, within reason. Obviously there's job delays and there's things that are under your control that can all be accounted for, but there has to be a continuity factor to the construction. And if that's the case, and then the project gets completed in 2023 or later, let's say you started in 22 or in 21, it's a big project, it's ongoing. That project in particular can now potentially take advantage of the 179D at the higher rate if it's completed in 2023 or later, without having to meet the prevailing wage requirement. So it's a bit of an opportunity for certain projects that have already been underway to take advantage of that higher deduction amount, the higher opportunity, without having to necessarily be having built using prevailing wage. Another way you can meet that requirement too, let's say, is a 5% rule. So there's 5%. If you spent 5% of the total cost of the project was spent on you know, activities, construction activity, and then it continues to be continuous, the work beyond that point. That's another way to meet that requirement and kind of check off the box for the test of meeting the beginning of construction date for your project. So all right, so let's get into some of the other changes around section 179D and some of the way that those changes could potentially affect you guys and be an opportunity. So one of the major changes of 179D that came about as part of the Inflation Reduction Act is now that there's the ability to allocate the deduction to not only the government building owners, but also the nonprofits and tribal governments. So nonprofits and tribal governments are now brought into the fold. They have the methodology to allocate this deduction to the designers. Now, as I mentioned before, we've just received this notice on prevailing wage from the IRS a couple weeks ago. We're waiting on the notices from the IRS on how 179D and all these other changes are going to be enacted and how they're going to come into play. So my expectation is that the treatment of these allocations will be very, very similar, and they're going to mirror the current rules that we have around the 179D being allocated on the government sector. But it's possible that the IRS may come out with a different methodology or different rules to be able to allocate these deductions to these nonprofit agencies and whatnot. So that's something that's a kind of a little bit of a wait and see. My expectation is that the rules will be very similar. as they would be for government allocation, but we have to just wait until it comes out. Hopefully it'll come out soon. There's been some activity by the IRS these past week on other Inflation Reduction Act changes where they issued notices. So they're working on it. It's just a matter of when, and that's always the case here. So we should expect to see that pretty soon. Now there's going to be a additional rule for qualifying, basically an additional methodology in the way you qualify 179D. So currently 179D, the way it's done is it's all design side. So you design a project, that project gets built, and then we independently verify that the designed building meets the ASHRAE requirement from it compared to an ASHRAE baseline. And then we verify that exceeds the 50% mark. And if it does, then you can take the deduction. Now there's going to be essentially a measurement and verification methodology to certify this in addition to the design methodology. So you can basically pick or choose which path you go down. And it's, again, this is a whole new section of the tax code that didn't exist prior to this. Again, we're waiting on the notices to issue the exact guidance on it. But what we expect to see and what we are reading is that you're going to end up with a project in a retrofit situation where we look at the energy use intensity of the building before it starts construction. Then we come back after the construction is complete 1 year later, and we verify based on the baseline we established pre-construction whether you're meeting and exceeding the energy saving requirements to be able to qualify for this incentive. So it's going to, honestly, most projects we would end up just certifying under the traditional methodology on the design side, just because there's no reason to wait a whole year, and most projects are going to end up qualifying anyways under that other methodology. But what we expect to see here is hopefully some of the technologies like solar and other technologies that are not able to be modeled under conventional 179D and ASHRAE 90.1, that fit within ASHRAE 90.1. We expect to see some of these other technologies hopefully come into play here. And again, I say hopefully because once again, we're waiting on the IRS to come out with the guidance, and hopefully they'll allow us to include the savings that are being generated from these other technologies without having to to do that. So we just have to see what that study looks like and what the exact rules and requirements are around it. But that's going to be in my hopes a very exciting expansion to 179D that could potentially bring a lot of benefit and really expand the type of projects that are being done out there, being financed by the PACE program, and hopefully we can add an element and expand the usage of this incentive to a lot more folks through that new rule. One more thing I'll focus on is that there's now 179D has the ability to be certified or recertified on a building in the private sector every 3 years. So historically, if you claim the maximum 179D, that was a one-time thing. You got your $1.80 a square foot, you took your entire 179D deduction, and you were never able to take the 179D again on that building. Even if you made more improvements, let's say you did a lighting project before, and now you went in and you did a brand new, chiller and whatnot, HVAC project, and you spent millions of dollars. It doesn't matter now. You couldn't do it either way. So you can take advantage of it just because you had previously taken advantage of it. So now for the private sector, every 3 years, you can reclaim it, assuming that you spent money and new energy improvements were made. And then every 4 years for government and tax exempt owned buildings can allocate it every 4 years to you. Again, assuming new improvements were made to that building. So REITs were expanded a little bit as part of this, these changes in the IRA, but honestly, that's more of a news highlight than anything else. It's really not going to bring much applicability to the REITs, the changes that were made. So I'm not even going to touch on that too much because it's not going to really make a difference or be substantially impactful there. All right, so let's talk about the 179D and how it works in the world of allocating these deductions to designers a bit. So this is a very important component to the 179D. There's a ton of usage of the 179D in the space where you have this deduction being allocated to designers, but then there's also there's a lot of misallocation of these incentives to non-designers, to folks who are involved simply in the construction. So one of the key things here is that as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, there was a ton of money that was earmarked, for IRS tax enforcement and audits and whatnot, and to expand the IRS. And the IRS has had their eye out on 179D for since 2016, 15, 16, specifically around the subject of the 179D being allocated erroneously to parties that weren't involved with the design. So there's some folks out there and some firms who kind of looked at this tax law and the bulletins and kind of interpreted it their own way. And they got a little loosey-goosey with the interpretation of who's a designer. And, so one of the key components here is you have to be contractually primarily responsible for the design. So, and that's from a very conventional methodology. If you're a contractor, you can take the deduction, but you have to be involved in a design build capacity where you're contractually responsible for design, or contractually responsible for the parties that were involved in the design, but you oversaw that and you oversaw their the way they did business, and not the way they did business, but you oversaw the way the design was going, and it was your responsibility to bring that to fruition. You can't just merely be a installer or a contractor who installs things that somebody else designed. So you can't go do a bid build job, bid it and be awarded it, build it, and then come out on site and make changes. Yeah, right. Every job has change orders. Every job has, value engineering things that get done to it. It's where a lot of you guys make your bread and butter by providing some of that value engineering. But that value engineering isn't sufficient from the IRS's threshold to consider yourselves to be the designer on those projects. So it's an area that we've seen a ton of audits around. So I mean, when we do work with most contractors, if they're amending returns, a lot of times even if they're not amending returns, they take 179D, they get picked up, they get looked at. Most of the firms we work with, all the firms we work with have never had any issues because we've always turned down the ones that aren't involved in the design. But there's a lot of folks out there who have been sold a bag of goods that they can take these incentives and have taken them, and now they're in IRS audit situations because they shouldn't have been the ones taking and having these deductions allocated to them. So it's just for rule of thumb, architects pretty clean, engineers are also pretty clean as long as they were contractually responsible. And look, most of the time the architects and the engineers are the ones actually doing the design work, right? When we're looking at contractors, so if you're a lighting company or a mechanical company or even just a general contractor, you have to have some sort of design build capability, right? So if you're a GC, design build contracts are pretty clean. If you're operating in different contract methodology beyond that, you have to really look at yourself and say, hey, was I responsible for the design? If you're like a lighting company and you're going in and you're specifying and doing line by lines and doing investment grade audits and specifying the lighting systems, you can very well be the designer on that job, because most times you're going to be contractually responsible for coming up with what the retrofits were and what the changes to the building were. So, and that those changes are going to generate energy savings. So that's an important component. So like ESCOs, performance contractors, HVAC contractors that work in that design space and specific retrofit markets, those are good opportunities for taking advantage of this designer situation. So all right, I'll jump into a couple questions, jump into 45L before we jump into a couple questions. Real quick on 45L. So again, back to waiting on Congress to come out with situation, with guidance and whatnot. A couple big things around 45L. is, the current version was extended as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we have any homes or multifamily that was placed in service in 2022 will still have the opportunity to claim it using the previous methodology, which is a little easier, going to be a little easier to qualify for. Starting in 2023 and beyond, after 2021, after the end of 2022, you can take advantage of it, but we're going to have to wait on the guidance to come out. But Energy Star is going to essentially be the guiding light for the standard tax credit. The credit's going to be expanded to $2,500 per dwelling unit. And then if you go with the Zero Energy Ready Homes program, that's going to go up to $5,000 per unit. So big expansion there. A little downside is multifamily projects need to meet the prevailing wage requirement. If they don't meet the prevailing wage requirement, they're going to see a $500 per unit deduction credit. I'm sorry, or so it's going to be reduced from $2,500 to $500. And if they do the Zero Energy Ready Homes program, they're going to see from $5,000 to $1,000. So key thing is single family homes do not have to be built using prevailing wage requirement, which is a good thing for the home builders in that space who are taking advantage of this incentive. It's something to think about. So any questions, feel free to type them in. I'll kind of, keep around. Dub, do we got any that have come in?
Yeah, it's building on one that was asked earlier, and I think you addressed it. But so if you can repeat the question on nonprofits eligibility, both for new and existing. I think maybe they had a technical outage, but yep.
So yeah, no, nonprofits, starting in 2023, nonprofits are going to have the ability to allocate the deduction to the designers of the energy efficient commercial building property. So they will be very much like government building owners are able to allocate the deduction now to those designers. There's going to be the same situation with nonprofits, I expect, right? We're waiting on the IRS to come out with the guidance, come out with what the full expectations are there and what it's going to look like. But the expectation is that we're going to see a mirrored allocation process from for the nonprofits as we do have currently for the government building owners that allocate the deduction over. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So for either of those categories, governmental or nonprofit, it's not they don't have a tax liability, so it's not a direct credit, but it's assignable to the designer that's involved in the project. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yeah, they have the ability to allocate it over, and the deduction hits the designer's tax return and can create some pretty attractive benefits there for the folks involved on the design side.
Okay.
Yeah. So if anybody has any questions or you think of something afterwards, our information is going to be up here at the end. But somebody else pop up with a question, Doug?
Yep, there is one. So just a clarification: the tax credit is assignable, or is it a rebate?
So just to clarify, it's 179D is not a tax credit; it's a deduction. So, and it's definitely not a rebate. So it has the ability to be allocated. So the way it works is the government building owner, in theory, gets looked at from a tax perspective as a taxpayer, but they don't have the ability to take this deduction. So they have the ability to, write an allocation letter and sign an allocation letter that passes the deduction over to that designer, and that designer can then on their tax return claim, if the building meets the requirements, all the other things still have to apply, but if the building meets the requirements, then they have the ability to take the deduction on the other deduction line item, just like you would when you go and take a client out and buy a cup of coffee and you throw it on your other deduction line item. It's an additional deduction to the tax return.
Okay. Looks like a couple more have come in. Just a clarification: the definition of governmental building, does that include municipal, county, and state buildings? Everything?
Yes. Absolutely. So the government, when we talk about government-owned buildings, we're talking from the lowest level of government to the highest level of government, right? So you're talking about all your low-level municipal counties, school districts. We've probably certified, I don't know, I want to say we've certified every ISD in Texas, but I know I'm lying because there's so many of them. But we've done so many of the ISDs in Texas. The school districts are very much within that range. We've done projects at University of Texas, we've done projects all over the state of Texas. And it could be any level, right? And then we've done like we've done city of Dallas, we've done stuff in Houston for the city. So there's it's quite a bit of wide range there when you look at it. But then it also goes all up into the Department of Defense and federal government as well. So it can be that whole wide range of governmental.
Okay, so broadest definition of governmental there.
Yep.
Okay. Next question, let's see, is a tax credit allocated to an energy audit company? I guess if I learned anything during this, it would depend on that energy audit company's involvement in the design, right?
Well, you need a job done. So
okay.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the answer there. So yeah, it would depend on your involvement in the audit, right? So if you create an audit and you specify and you're kind of contractually responsible for that specification and design, sure, you can very well be party to that incentive, but you have to have been involved within the design, right, in order to be able to take it.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, I'm seeing no more questions posted here. I think we had some good ones, and David's got his contact information up on the screen now. And again, we appreciate everyone joining us. There's obviously a lot of moving parts in this, but I think the major takeaway is that if a building is being designed to a high performance standard for whatever reason, and it probably then is going to qualify for PACE, it probably is going to qualify for utility rebates. It may also qualify for 179D. And if it's worthwhile to go through the qualification process, this is sort of money on the ground potentially that should be taken into account by the owner and the owner's designers and other contractors. So kind of stacking, I guess that's another question, David, is there's no restriction, right? So if you have a utility incentive, PACE financing, then you could still claim the tax credit in addition to those things.
Yes, sir. Yeah,
Okay.
There's really no limitation there. The only thing where, if there was a rebate that directly reduced the cost of the property versus, standard rebate where kind of goes back to the client, where like a rebate which reduced the cost of the lighting fixture, like a direct product rebate. In that case, then it would reduce the cost, which could potentially reduce the amount of 179D,
right.
but 179D is capped at the cost of the projects done. So odds are it's not going to be an issue from that point of view.
So if it impacts the cost basis for that project element, then it could, but it's usually not done that way.
Usually not. The only time we see stuff like that sometimes is in like parking garages and where you have a lot of square footage, but the cost wasn't that high to do the lighting and things of that nature. Yeah.
Right. Well, very good. David, appreciate you being with us today. We'll give the folks who've attended a few minutes back of their afternoon.
Yeah.
And again, look for more webinars and more training opportunities that we'll be offering in 2023. And certainly keep up with the changes with 179D. Could be a very beneficial incentive for owners you're working with, or if you're an owner yourself. And with that, we will end for the day. So thank you. Happy holidays to everyone, and please be safe.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Dub. Have a great day.
Bye. You too. Bye.